So in my presentation, I will try to focus on the EU level. A lot has been said about the Irish level, so I'd like to change a bit the focus. Here are my key messages. So I'm trying to take you through the performance of the EU member states in terms of their employment and social outcome. And I will stress that there is a process of divergence that has been taking place whereby the member states are actually drifting away from each other, if you want. And that's problematic because socioeconomic convergence is at the very heart of the European integration project. So where does that take us? And then I'll try to make some suggestions to overcome those problems and then to foster more decent work in the EU. So my first point is that the crisis has actually increased the heterogeneity of employment outcome between the member states. If you look at this graph here, that's a comparison between the unemployment rate between 2000 and 2014. And in red, you see those countries where the rate has actually increased, so there have been more unemployment. And in green, those are the countries where there's been an improvement, there is less unemployment. And what you see is that, of course, a very huge diversity of situation, big heterogeneity across the member states. And that has been exacerbated by the crisis. Actually, before the crisis, the ratio between the highest and the lowest unemployment rate in the EU was 1 to 3. It was between Slovakia and Denmark at the time in 2007. After the crisis, we have a ratio of 1 to 5 between Germany and Greece. So we see those processes of divergence taking place on employment. The next is that if we look at GDP per capita, which is often used as a proxy for living standards, then we observe, of course, you see here there's the middle line, the brown one, is actually the coefficient of variation. So that gives you an indication of the convergence versus divergence that have been taking place. So of course, you see when there is the process of enlargement, for example, in 2004, when we've got 10 Eastern European member states joining the Union, you see, of course, a process of divergence because those countries are coming in with very different living standards. But then you see that after the crisis, there is no longer a process of convergence. And that's a key point. And the other important point of that graph is that you see the minima and the maxima, so the lowest and the highest line, show you that actually the countries that are better off get better off, and the countries that are worse off get worse off. So we see this process of divergence. And then if we take out the same graph, we take out the new member states, so the countries that have joined the EU in 2004 and after, well, we see a clear divergence again since the crisis. That's the first point. And about the same development between the highest, the minima and the maxima. So again, pointing out to the fact that, the socioeconomic convergence that was at the very heart of the EU process is not taking place. And this is mainly due to the situation, the deterioration of the situation in the Eastern European countries, in the southern country, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Cyprus. Let me go to this one first. If we look at inequality, I think what is interesting there is that we see, so this is the new member states, and you see the difference between the new member states, so the one that joined the EU after 2004, and the EU 27 at the time. Croatia wasn't included. And then here we see there have been convergence in terms of inequality, but convergence towards deteriorating outcome. So in other words, member states are getting closer to one another when it comes to inequality, but on a downward trend, if you want. So that's not very positive. So let me take you to the other one. I don't think this graph deserves a lot of comment. It's very clear. We have a gap in investment as well, very clearly between before and after the crisis. You see the investment in 2013 just dropped compared to before the crisis. So what are the causes of those divergence that we now observe among the member states? where first of all there are reasons that are to be found at the national level. I mean, the situation of the different countries is of course extremely different. I mean, I'm thinking in particular in the Eastern European countries that are starting from a very different position than the Western European country. But we also see now more and more this divide between North and South. So in some countries, including Ireland, I understand there were some situations of bubbling imbalances. That's certainly the case of Spain as well. And also different institutional setting that can explain, at the national level, that can explain to a large extent those differences. But the point is that, the point that I would like to make is that there is also a process at the EU level that is taking place and that can explain those divergences as well. And the policy responses at the EU level and the structural imbalances, in particular in the construction of the EMU, the Economic and Monetary Union, actually have generated to a certain extent those divergences as well. And that needs to be fixed if we want to get back to the path of jobs and growth in the EU. The policy responses actually... I think there's a fundamental flaw in the construction of the Economic and Monetary Union. Countries are faced with, within the EU, the euro area, we are in a monetary union. So when countries are faced with an asymmetric shock, they cannot rely on the monetary on their monetary policy because it's fixed by the European central banks for the whole euro area. So they cannot rely on the monetary policy, and they can actually hardly rely on their fiscal policy because the fiscal policy is constrained by the Growth and Stability Pact. And that leaves them with very little margin of maneuver in order to respond to the shock that they may be facing. And actually, one of the few options that are left is actually having an internal devaluation, a process through which the country tries to recover competitiveness through a decrease in wages and costs. And this has been partly the case in Spain in particular. And that's very, of course, and this internal devaluation is very likely to generate deteriorating social and employment outcome. So here, I think the point is that we need to have a EMU-wide approach, like a fiscal capacity at the EU level that could actually support those countries that are going through turbulences, economic turbulences. There's also some flaw in the coordination process. As you know, probably the socio-economic governance in the EU, at the EU level, is managed through what is called the European semester. And this European semester is very imbalanced in our view, because when it comes to macroeconomic policy or fiscal policy, then you have binding coordination mechanisms. Member states are obliged to comply with certain rules and regulations. When it comes to employment or social issues, this obligation doesn't exist anymore, and then we're talking about soft coordination mechanisms through which we have goals that are set at the EU level. So we commit to have an employment rate of 75%, but there is no real efficient follow-up procedure or no real budget attached to that. So we have this imbalance between very binding procedure when it comes to macroeconomic and fiscal policy, and this very soft kind of governance coordination process when it comes to social and employment policy. And the result of that is, of course, that eventually, because of this imbalance, eventually employment and social issue are used ended up being the adjustment variable. And the economy is actually balanced using employment and social issue as a stabilization mechanism. So why are those convergence, those divergence, why is it problematic to have such a level of divergence? Well, because that can actually take us into a vicious cycle. The vicious cycle of low investment, of high unemployment, of migration of talented people, and limited fiscal space that in turn is funding low investment. Second point is also been mentioned this morning, the problem of aggregate demand. I mean, when you're implementing austerity, you're cutting, and you have then a shortage of aggregate demand throughout the EU. According to ILO calculation, there is 250 billion euros saving that are, in excess compared to the investment. So, of course, and that's a problem, especially to address one of the key challenges that face the European economy, which is the very profound transformation that are taking place in the world of work, and in particular the technological revolution. Of course, risk of social cohesion, and I think the key question that EU member states, or at least Euro member states are faced with now is, can the euro be an optimal currency area without further progress and jobs and investment? In other words, to what extent can we go on with those processes of divergence if they are not addressed? So we believe that the priority should be on trying to foster upward socioeconomic convergence in the EU. And I think Michel refers to it. There is an initiative that has been launched by the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and is proposing a European pillar of social rights. So it's a bit unclear yet how this will look like, because there is now a consultation process. But what is clear is that it would be indeed necessary to have a kind of a floor upon which you could, a floor on social and employment issue that would be applicable to all member states, and then you could actually build upon. That would create a social playing field, among the member states, and that would help actually to go towards this process of convergence. Also, the boost to convergence. So how do you give a boost to convergence? Well, as I said, having a fiscal capacity at the EU level would certainly be helpful, because that would really support those member states that are going through turbulences. Shocks can happen anywhere, at any moment, but because the member states are so different, their capacity, their resilience to those shocks is very different. And each country will absorb the shock, the impact of the shock will be very different to each country. So those asymmetric shock requires somehow some degree of transfer, of balances among the member states. And we also certainly need a stronger coordination of employment and social policy. Now, this is my last slide. So coming from the ILO, I'm gonna try to make a bit of promotion for the international labor standards. And actually, Michel was referring to, the difficulty of in Ireland, but I think it's a problem that is also true in virtually every European country. How do we draw the line between who is in an employment relationship, who is an employee, and who is a self-employed? That has become a widespread problem throughout Europe. So we have actually an ILO recommendation. It's recommendation 198 on the employment relationship that actually provides some guidance on how you can, how national legislation can actually provide some clarity as to who is in an employment relationship and who is not. But that's not the one that I want. I'm just responding to your presentation, but that's not the one I wanted to talk about here. We have identified actually 5 areas of work that we think should be a priority, especially in the context of the new initiative of President Juncker on the social pillar. And those are, let me start by the last one, skills. Skills is, in my view, skills development, in my view, is very important. We have a huge mismatch, skills mismatch in Europe, and that is likely to be more and more problematic in the future. So having some kind of European-wide approach toward skill and skills development would appear to be a priority. The minimum wage and the collective bargaining, I think, has been mentioned quite a lot in the conference. we still need to recover from the crisis in terms of collective bargaining. I mean, a country like Portugal used to have, I mean, Eurofond is here, they should probably correct me, but I think they used to have about 500 collective bargaining agreements every year. I think now they're down to 50 or something like that. So we still need to recover from the crisis in terms of social dialogue, in terms of collective bargaining agreement, and it will take time. But that should be a priority promoted by the European Commission and the European institutions. Minimum income should be another priority in our view. Actually, if we use the poverty threshold that is defined in the EU, which is 60% of median income, well, actually, if you look at the minimum income in some of the member states, it's not even half of that. So if you have a poverty threshold of 60% of median income at the national level, then you will find some minimum wages, some minimum income that are at 30%. So not even half of the poverty threshold. I mean, that requires definitely to look at the problem of adequacy of minimum income in the EU. Another key priority is the issue of work and family reconciliation. We have more and more single parents in our society. It's probably true for Ireland, and it's true for mainly all European countries. We need more investment in care. It's actually also a way of creating jobs. And we need fathers also to get more involved in the care of the children, the elderly, and the people who are sick. And finally, the activation, more and better activation policies in the EU. I mean, the colleague from Denmark told us that Denmark is investing 1.5% of GDP in active labor market policy. Well, you know, Romania is investing 0.1%. So there's huge gaps here as well that needs to be addressed. Thank you very much.